So good evening. Thank you, Malia, for hosting this event, this webinar that I'm going to be providing to you all today, whether it's live and in person or it is virtually on demand. And this evening that we are going to be talking about specifically is autism therapies and best practice supports. Believe it or not, there are multiple and many of them. And we're going to go through some of that, what it looks like, where it's been, where we're going, and hopefully you can get a lot of information from this. So as I speak tonight, there's an ever evolving mindset of changing from person first language to identity first language. People first language started in the 1970s and actually started in Oregon. And a group of self-advocates went to the Oregon legislature and said they wanted people first language because of the derogatory and dehumanizing language they were using to describe a person rather than they were an actual person. So that's why you hear a lot of people, I would say my age, use first language, because there was a process that we having to change a whole system. As a matter of fact, the Washington legislature, they changed even the language that they had, removing the word mental retardation and putting in people first language. But as time has gone on, is identity first language has evolved, and it's an expression of culture and diversity rather than the pathology. So rather than saying a person with autism as if autism is separate from the individual, autistic individuals prefer that we use identity first, which is autism. So this is an ever evolving process, and the likelihood that we could have gone from where we were in the 1970s to identity first language likely would not have ever happened. So it is a process of that we went from person first to now identity first language. So throughout this training, you're going to hear me refer to people as being a person with autism, a person that experiences autism, or an autistic person. So I want to be respectful of everybody who comes with a different perspective and provide that throughout this webinar. So the resources that I'm going to provide you are based on a lot of different research entities in the United States. And the resources that I'm going to be referencing tonight are from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is ASAN, the Center for Disease Control, the IAN Project through Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is the Interactive Autism Network, the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence-Based Practice, then the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, Evidence-Based Practices for Children, Youth, and Young Adults with Autism. This is the third generation review. The U.S. Department of Education, the Mind Institute, Spectrum News, and North Carolina Chapel Hill Teach Program, and OCALI, which is the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incident Disabilities. So these are the resources and references, and that's a lot of the information that I'm going to be providing to you are from those entities. So what are evidence-based practices? Well, an evidence-based practice is really an instructional or intervention procedure or set of procedures that either a researcher has provided an acceptable level of research that shows the practice produces positive outcomes for children, youth, and adults with autism. It has to be evidence-based. It has to be that it's research-based, that it just, a teacher just can't come in and say, well, we're going to try this because I think it's really cool. Unless it has research and evidence-based backing to it, that teacher cannot implement those strategies. So And this has been, again, just as the difference between people first language and identity first language, this has been an evolution. And that my son is in his late 30s. The vantage point that I will express during this, you will see how and why this is important. So why best practice evidence-based strategies and supports, individuals on the spectrum and their families is really the basis for all of it. Is identification of evidence-based practices allows individuals, their families, their advocates, their guardians, the best possible support and educational basis on current research. When I'm referring to my son, like I said, he's in his late 30s. When he was entering into school, the Individuals with Disability Education Act wasn't even a thing. Evidence-based practice wasn't a thing. Just his ability to enter a school just started. So Public Law 94-142 had just passed in 1974, and then it started allowing children who had disabilities to actually enter school. So this, in just my son's lifetime, up to the age of, many people that are watching this, have changed over the years. We know that educators and practitioners in schools and the community, that the identification of evidence-based practice allows educators and practitioners to select appropriate interventions based on the age, the need, and the outcomes of those they serve. When, again, just in looking back now, I look back, it's been 24 years that when my son was in high school, I started a regional autism consulting cadre, where I was bringing evidence-based practices to the state of Washington to teach teachers how to implement, how to use the strategies, because there wasn't anything available at the time. It was just kind of a hit and miss. And oftentimes students who had behavioral challenges were ostracized, were being put in, unfortunately, there's still places that use separation and segregation, isolation booths. There were a lot of things that happened that had punitive and very negative impact on children. Educators now, actually with the reauthorization of IDEA of 1997 and 2004, said that teachers have to have the backing and education on best practice evidence-based strategies, not just for autism, but for all disabilities. And that meant that teachers needed to have a master's degree. So that changed. We needed teachers to have more information so that they could help with the whole role of what the concept of Public Law 94-142 and IDEA was, that children with disabilities have a right to free and appropriate public education. And that is the ultimate word is appropriate, free and appropriate public education. And yet there's a lot of people that could still argue the fact that their sons or daughters, their loved ones, have not had the free and appropriate public education. But that we have now best practices. I would say now, that's been in the last 30 years, that there is an opportunity to advocate for those. And a one size does not fit all, because we know evidence-based is really based on the age, the needs, and the outcomes of the students they serve. Then we have researchers who the identification of evidence-based practices allows researchers to better understand and identify research gaps and plan for future studies. So as best practices have evolved, new best practices have also come into play that once was an up-and-coming evidence-based practice really has been identified as not being as effective, that we want to use something else. So researchers have been able to do double-blind studies, have been able to find out more, especially from the Office of Education, that finding out where some of these gaps are has been important. Advocacy groups and policymakers, identification of evidence-based practices really allows advocates and policymakers to make informed decisions about practices and policies that will benefit individuals on the autism spectrum. When my son was a child and in school, there weren't evidence-based practices. As a matter of fact, there was not there wasn't internet. There were books. And the only thing that I really had to go on was the Autism Society of America. And that, going to the library and doing research. The doctor didn't know. Nobody knew. And so, in fact, having something in place has been a process of work by advocacy groups to change the way evidence-based practices are supported in the schools. And I can tell you by the training that I do in schools, it doesn't mean that every teacher knows every evidence-based practice. A teacher who has a master's degree, the unfortunate reality is it doesn't mean that they necessarily had to have it in special education. And so although the letter of the law is being followed, it doesn't really circle back to the intention of what the law meant. So I do know, like, for instance, a teacher who went back and got her degree in her master's degree in music. Although music and music therapy is a best practice evidence-based strategy, that wasn't her intent. And that's sometimes the unfortunate reality. Then we have healthcare providers and insurance companies. Identification of evidence-based practices allow healthcare providers and insurance companies to appropriately identify a range of evidence-based practice that can provide funding or reimbursement to people across the spectrum and their families. I'll get into this a little bit later in this presentation, but that's where some of the pushback on ABA in particular, because there is evidence, there are outcomes. Insurance companies prefer ABA therapy because of the outcomes that they're able to measure, not necessarily how it may be difficult for the individual. It doesn't address the neurodiversity of the individual. And so that's another place where advocates are pushing back on insurance companies, because right now ABA holds a monopoly on best practice strategies. And it was interesting because Washington did not pay for ABA services until, I want to say, 2010. Could have been a little bit earlier than that. So that's only been 13 years ago. Before that, it was people were paying out of pocket for ABA services. I knew of families who second mortgaged their home so that their son, daughter, loved one got evidence-based practices using ABA therapy, that they cashed in their retirement. They did whatever they could to help their loved one get the services that they needed. So, like I said, it's come a long way, but there are still barriers. And ABA is not for everyone. And as I said, we'll get into kind of the controversy around ABA, but I want to go into, I think, more on the best practices and, what does it mean, and how can you choose as either being a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, whomever, that we look at best practices. Like I said, in 2000, and just to kind of go back, in 2010, when it was finally passed that insurance companies through mm, what do you call it here in the state of Washington? The insurance, anyway, the oversight of insurance companies, that they could not deny it, people access to ABA services. So what I can tell you is people jumped on the ABA bandwagon like nobody's business. We have people jumping in, and schools, we're getting people certified in BCBA as a BCBA, providing ABA services, because it was a way that they could get paid. And so that's some of the reality when it comes to ABA services that advocates, families are pushing back on. So I thought I would share this with you. This is a family that wrote as part of the Office of Education, and this is just a very small, out of context information. This family says, this is mom. She said, I've been on the autism journey for 30 years now, more than half my life. She's back in 1990 when Chris was first diagnosed. That's her son. Is that when Chris was diagnosed, there were no Autism Awareness Month, because there was no Autism Speaks, there was no autism awareness. It was just autism. Family, friends, and neighbors looked at me quizzically when I shared the diagnosis. What does that mean? How did he get it? How do you cure it? And that was a lot of things that we and I'm actually paraphrasing, I'm putting information in here if you don't notice, but there was actually a group that was called Cure Autism Now, that was from the state of Washington, that really was looking a way to cure autism. But we know you cannot cure autism. It is a neurological disorder. And so at any rate, there are, like people would say, how do you cure it? And then she goes on to say, but I did not have the answers. Even the multitude of doctors we saw could not provide the answers. Since that time, there has been an exponential increase in the number of children diagnosed, and almost everyone has been touched by autism in some way. So today, when a family shares a diagnosis, others are usually aware of what it means, or they know somebody who has somebody with autism in their life. I can share, that I have a son with autism, and 99% of the time someone will say, oh, my nephew has autism, or I have my neighbor's son has autism, or the lady at, whatever, her grandson has autism, or granddaughter. So there is, like I said, I can't tell you that I can tell you when my son was born, the idea of autism was vague, very vague. There was one TV show that actually showed a person with autism, and I want to say it was called Chicago Hope, and it was again, sort of like all the other hospital dramas. One of the doctors had a son who had autism, and and I would say it was shared in a very negative light, that he was very very inward. He did a lot of head banging, self-injurious behaviors. And so, people then had that mindset. And then shortly after that, you had Rain Man. And so Rain Man, that was portrayed by Dustin Hoffman, was somebody who was an autistic savant, meaning he had incredible skills in numbers. And his brother at the time, portrayed by Tom Cruise, he was using him to basically win at casino, win at gambling. And it wasn't until he didn't even know he had a brother until his father died. And he remembered as a small child that he knew of somebody named called Rain Man. And it wasn't Rain Man, it was actually Raymond. And his name was Raymond, and he had been sent to an institution at a very early age, and he never knew he existed until his father died. That was the norm. That was the absolute norm. And I can tell you that was one experience that I had in my family as well, is I had a cousin. Well, my family, I mean, I have many cousins, but one family on my dad's side I had 4 cousins, and I was probably a senior in high school when my sister mentioned the word or the name Brian. And I said, Brian who? What are you talking about? She was Brian Breaker. I said, who is that? What are you talking about? And she said, well, he's been in Fairview in Oregon, literally since the age of 4. That was what she was told. My aunt was told is, you need to take care of the other 4 children and pretend he was never born by putting him in this institution. And frankly, no one ever talked about him. That was the norm. So going and learning this family's journey of 30 years is, this is their story. And then I wanted to share with you, a little bit about my story. I mean, that started almost 40 years ago. Michael's almost 40. Just as a family who mentioned in the previous slide, let's just go back another 10 years. Michael's diagnosis was late in coming. He was 8 years old before he was diagnosed with autism. And that was because there was no diagnosticians. There wasn't an autism center to go to. There wasn't a pediatric diagnostician who could identify the characteristics of autism. I happened to stumble across one. I was a clinical administrator for a pediatric and internal medicine clinic, and the pediatric side my children went to, and I knew the doctors really well. I knew, all the nurses and medical assistants. And it just happened on one day, on Wednesdays, that we had another nurse, I'm not a nurse, a doctor who came in to the clinic on Wednesday, and she only worked one day a week because she was raising her children. And it was when the other 2 pediatricians that we had, they either had hospital rounds or they took that day off just to catch up on their work. And so Dr. Sage was her name, and she was a pediatric developmental pediatrician. And when I took Michael in to have his ears checked, Michael was sitting on the floor and he was flipping basically my pant leg, just kind of flipping it back and forth. And she looked at me and she said, Monica, I didn't know you had a son with autism. And I was like, well, by golly, I didn't know either. They had basically said that Michael has a developmental disability, that he has at the time they said he had mental retardation, which is now an intellectual disability, because thank God that word mental retardation, which actually just brings up my ire, has been eliminated from a lot of people's language. So I had no idea. I had no idea that this is what Michael experienced. So his diagnosis was late in coming. And like I said, it was more happenstance. Michael's ability to even access an educational building, that it was just a new thing. It had just passed in 1974. Michael was born in 1983. IDEA was passed in 1990 and wasn't even implemented until 1991. Michael was in grade school. The reauthorization of IDEA came in 1997, when they really started focusing on the behavioral attributes of a person and positive behavior supports in doing functional behavior analysis. Those are things that did not exist in the 80s and 90s. There were not best practice evidence-based strategies. The school, the teacher, the family, they basically, sought their own path, did their own thing. Although ABA was available, but that was to a very small group of families who, like I said, either second mortgage the house, cashed in their retirement, moved to Los Angeles to be close to the university, UCLA, UCLA, where Dr. Lovas was. And then Teach has been around from Chapel Hill, North Carolina since the 70s, but it was not considered an evidence-based best practice. It was just, if you happen to live in North Carolina, you had access to it, but it wasn't something that was nationally known. It wasn't anything that we had any sort of recourse to. It was just a hit and miss. And I can tell you, when Michael was must have been in kindergarten, and one of the normal, or the typical, I wouldn't say normal, one of the typical behavior interventions that they did for Michael is basically tie him to a chair. That was the intervention that they used, because he would just get up and run out of the classroom. He was nonverbal. We knew he had an intellectual disability. And what they were seeking and trying to get him to do was compliance. They just wanted him to comply. And again, that was something that he didn't understand it. He wanted out of there. And his first, I would say his elementary and middle school years of his educational career were dismal. And that's being kind. So let's look at the categories of evidence-based practices. Excuse me while I get something to drink. Within each of these categories is also a list of what some of the curriculum that has been created around behavioral, like behavioral interventions. Research involves a wide array of behavioral therapies and training methods, including the theory of applied behavior analysis. And I'm going to get into that. ABA is not a best practice. ABA is an umbrella term for things such as discrete trial training, behavioral therapy. It is a behavioral intervention. There were the early start Denver model, the imitation training, which is compliance training, joint attention training. The Lovas method is what people referred to as discrete trial training. Later came pivotal response training, sibling mediated interventions, and social skills training. These were all behavioral interventions. And as we get through them, you will see that many of those exist, many of those have evolved, and even more are considered best practice evidence-based services in treatment for people or autistic person or a person with autism. There's complementary dietary alternatives. Some examples in this group were, acupressure, acupuncture, antioxidants, cholesterol supplementation, nutritional supplements, probiotics, special diets like gluten-free, casein-free. I remember going to a conference, and this was probably in the, I'm going to say late 2000. And it was a mom who had written a book on diet, specifically the gluten-free, casein-free. And, it was very interesting. I wanted to learn more about it. It was, what really got me is that she basically challenged my motherhood by saying, if you don't do this diet, you are a poor parent. You need to be doing this diet, basically saying you're not a good parent if you do not do this diet. And immediately, again, my ire kind of was like, what the heck? I gotta study more on this. So that was, some of the things that really. Then there was, the B complex. You need to have your kid on, the nutritional supplements, a lot of B complex. Not to say that these things are not successful, because there are some things that I do use as complementary dietary alternative ways to support my son, because he does have a complex medical conditions, and he does benefit from probiotics, special diets. And his in particular is a keto diet because he has an intractable seizure disorder. Those were things, again, that even in the epilepsy and other neurodivergent type of diagnosis, there's so much that has been learned. And again, like in the early 2000, I remember, again, another opportunity to go to a conference. And like I said, I was coordinating this regional autism consulting cadre, and we brought in researchers and evidence-based practice curriculum designers to come in and talk, and researchers. And I remember a doctor saying, that they were really close to identifying a cluster of genes that actually is related to autism. So they didn't even, back in early 2000, didn't even see that there were the connection that could be related to genetics when it comes to autism. And obviously, we know that it does. And just in the last 4 years, my son was diagnosed with a genetic mutation, a genetic condition called SYNGAP1. And it is one of the first identification of genes that happen to, that's related to the gap between your synapse, and it's called SYNGAP. And so there is a disconnection, which causes the conditions of autism, epilepsy, low muscle tone, which just described my son to a T. That was only discovered in 2009. So that was only 14 years ago. Michael happens to be of the 1,250 people in the world diagnosed with SYNGAP1. He's the third oldest. And of course, we don't really know a whole lot about it. Even at this point, we just know that it is a thing. And there is more research being done. So now we have educational, nearly all autism spectrum disorder research conducted in the classroom falls under this subcategory. So including curricula, educational methods, best practice, inclusive program, education programs, math, reading, positive behavior support, special educations, and other behavioral interventions developed for and tested specifically for educational settings. And like I said, that also harkened back to the reason why teachers needed to have the master's degree so that they could be a teacher who had a higher educational standard. Then we have the medical and pharmacological interventions. This subcategory includes clinical research on drugs, antidepressants, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics. And I always forget, this is like an anti-anxiety medication, hormones and stimulants to treat autism. And again, it was in the late, I would say, close to 2010 when risperidol was marketed and widely researched, widely disseminated research as being the cure-all for autism. Of course, we know that this risperidol is not the cure-all for autism, but it did have the efficacy rate for risperidol for individuals who did take risperidol. At least 50% of those had a better control over their self-injurious behaviors, their aggression, those types of things. And then the categories diminished after that. So at best, there was a 50% efficacy rate that went from changes in behaviors to having little or no effect for an individual, to the other end of the spectrum, which risperidol oftentimes cause psychosis. And so the medical pharmacological interventions, they know the first and primary treatment for autism is educational supports and behavioral interventions. The medical pharmacological should be one of the last interventions to be able to be implemented because of the wiring of the brain. And there is, again, a lot of research on that, especially out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, out of their medical school, and that they are in conjunction with the TEACH program, that they really showed that oftentimes these medications have a paradoxical effect. And my son would be one of them, is, when he was younger, wanting to he needed to have either like a CAT scan or an MRI, or go to the dentist, that like the dentist would prescribe, well, let's give him some Valium so that it would calm him down. We'd be able to do his teeth. Well, what it would do is just ramp him up, and he would not sleep for 2 or 3 days. And it was overwhelming. And in finally having a neurologist said, yeah, his brain does not, what's the word? Assimilate to what the intention of the medications are doing. And oftentimes his brain tries to fight it, and he has a paradoxical effect to that. So I can tell you, Michael has, again, and the research, and I know Temple Grandin has talked about it, and I'm trying to remember, and I'm sorry I didn't have this detail, but the doctor who did, and I'm sure it would be in the CDC, that oftentimes what would be a typical dosage for an adult, for an adult with autism or for a child with autism, the best thing to do is start at a much lower dose. And that's what actually happened with my son. We had him on a medication. He was having just horrendous anxiety. And so putting him on an antidepressant, I said, I do not want him at a regular dose. I want him at about a quarter of a dose. And so he has been on this medication now, I want to say for 10 years, still at the quarter of dose, and it has made a substantial difference in his life. What happens oftentimes is doctors see, well, if it's not working, we're going to bump it up. There is data that shows that because of the neurodiversity of that person's brain, how it functions, it is not the same as a neurotypical person who can assimilate and modulate the medications. Then we have the model system therapeutic targets. So our research in this subcategory uses, animal models, uses companion animals, uses horseback riding. And there has been a lot of really good outcomes from that. A lot of children who've been able to access, especially hippotherapy is what they refer to it, horse therapy, or having a companion dog. They help with relaxation. And like I said, this isn't something just specifically to autism, but it works very, very much for a lot of people. My son in particular, he has a companion dog. And this companion dog, although Michael doesn't interact with him, just, when I see him, I'm like, oh, his name is Scooby. It's like, come here, Scooby. And I'll pet him and I play with him. And Michael will touch him, but he doesn't pet him. And though when Michael is anxious, Scooby is right by him. If he has a seizure, Scooby is right beside him. Scooby hasn't been trained on this. Scooby just wants to be there. And so those are some of the therapeutic ways that people can do that. There are other, there's a place in Oregon that they use Newfoundland dogs, and they're called anchor dogs. And basically the child with autism has this therapy dog with them, the anchor dog, and he is basically harnessed to the dog. And so when you have a child who is an eloper, who is a person that runs, who gets in the fight, flight, or freeze, and then the flight part just takes off and health and safety is not even a consideration, these dogs will just stop, and the child has to stop as well. And these sometimes can be a 150-pound dog, and if you have a 70 or 80-pound child, there are some benefits to that. There's the model or therapeutic targets. Oh, I already said that, animals. And then there's occupational, physical, and sensory-based therapies. And there's been a lot in regard to sensory integration or sensory therapeutic supports and understanding a person's sensory needs, like using weighted blankets, like just understanding the person's sensory needs, whether it is, their olfactory, their sense of smell, their touch, they're being distracted by things like maybe too much light or not enough light or too many people. There are a lot of things that an occupational therapist, physical therapist, and a sensory-based therapy can do to help an individual. Years ago, after I left the clinical setting, I worked in as a family resource specialist at a birth to 3 program that I coordinated. And that was one of the things that I learned so much at being part of the therapy team, is learning how occupational therapy works for children. And although it may look or feel just kind of, where are you going with this? Like, for instance, having a child sit on a ball, the process and the development of a child, you think, how can an occupational therapist help a child learn to talk, learn to write, or use his or her fine motor skills? And the idea that children, as a developmental process, they need to have control of their trunk, meaning their core needs to have, your muscles need to be developed. If your muscles are not developed, then your ability to use fine motor skills is compromised. So that is the natural way that your body works, is just as a child starts to walk, then they'll start to explore with things with their hands, put things in their mouth. There is a developmental process that goes to that. And that's where occupational and physical therapy can help. Then there's technology-based interventions, which is that is where, the up and coming services and supports are really based around technology. Technology is something that we all use. And I can say it's been a transformation for a lot of people that I've worked with. I can also say that if the support specialist, the direct support provider, the job coach, the teacher, the paraeducator does not understand or know what specific software applications to use, it then just becomes a tool for, like, if it's an iPad, that they're able to search on the internet, or use it more as a leisure or recreational activity, when we can use it as a technology-based intervention. There are, like I said, so many things. There are wearable sensors, so we always know where a person is. Like for my son, he has a watch that he wears, and the watch can tell his direct support provider when he's having a seizure, or when basically it starts to measure when he starts developing the signs of having a seizure. So his direct support provider, who might be in the kitchen making dinner, will immediately know, I need to be with him. So the technology it's becoming a really important part for a lot of people's lives, not only for people with autism, but our aging population, for children. The results are endless, and it's really an exciting time to see how technology can help a lot of people that we love, we support. Like I said, it's very exciting. And so here are some uncategorized autism evidence-based best practices. So uncategorized means what I just went through is these are the categories of best practices. I've listed these that are uncategorized, but are, like, for animal-assisted intervention. That would be obviously something that's in the model system, or the occupational and physical sensory-based therapies, like horseback riding, etc. So you look at this list, and this is not a complete comprehensive list. This is a combination of the resources I provided you, like the CDC, the office, Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incident Disabilities, the National Institute on Health, the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorder or Diseases. So this is a combination of all of them, and these are considered best practice evidence-based services and supports. And I would imagine there's a lot of these that don't even look at all familiar. And I can tell you, I could go through the training that I have had. I have 4 of them, and I have 4 of them that I go back to consistently because I've had the training and continued training and certification on that. But, like the animal assisted intervention, antecedent-based interventions, which is really plays in conjunction with positive behavior supports using the characteristics of autism and evidence-based strategies that can put in support strategies for that person based on an antecedent, such as we want to make sure that the student, when he goes into the classroom, perhaps he or she, your loved one goes into the classroom 10 minutes before class starts or 10 minutes after, because the auditory intensity and the visual distraction are things that really cause him to get into a fight or flight. And that would be part of his antecedent-based interventions, knowing and understanding based on what is called the competing behavior diagram, where you look at, the setting event, the history, what the trigger could be. And then you try and understand based on the characteristics of autism, what this person is trying to communicate, and find a different way or an alternative way to get those needs met. So that all is based on antecedent-based interventions. And then there's the AAC, Augmentative Alternative Communication Supports, which there are probably people that are familiar with picture exchange. That there is also an application called Proloco to Go. Dynavox has many AAC augmentative communication devices. There's the copyrighted AIRS sensory inventory, which is basically a process of identifying where the sensory needs of an individual are, and then putting in place a sensory diet so that person is getting their sensory needs in a more functional way for your loved one. Then there's behavioral momentum intervention. And if I look up, it's because I've got my whole library, and golly, what was the name of that intervention? It is an intervention. It'll come to me probably about 2 o'clock in the morning, but it's a movement process of walking beside a student, a child, and that they are they become part of the movement is actually how communication and it's relationship-based intervention. Got it. So that's what the behavioral movement intervention. There's cognitive behavior instruction and strategies. And if you're familiar with Dr. Tony Atwood, who is a psychologist in either Australia or New Zealand. He actually has a game that is cognitive, I think it's called CAT, Cognitive Alternative Therapies. At any rate, it is a game to help individuals understand and help using cognitive behavior supports, and through this teaching strategies and then implementation and generalization into the rest of your loved one's life, that they're able to identify and make better choices and help them understand their behavioral challenges that they may experience. There's another copyrighted collaborative model for promoting competence and success. Although Compass, and like I said, it is something that is it is very much along the lines of relationship development interventions, and it is another collaborative modeling, differential reinforcement, which again kind of goes along the lines of discrete trial training. There's direct instruction, discrete trial training. There's behavioral extinction. There's functional behavior assessment with positive behavior support outcomes, functional communication training, massage, matrix learning, music-mediated intervention, naturalistic intervention, outdoor adventure programs, parent implement interventions, of which relationship development intervention was basically based on parent implementation intervention, because there were a group of families in Texas that did not have a social relationship with their loved one. Their child was basically saw them as just another piece of furniture in their life. And so using those strategies, the parent implemented intervention, it is a way to help create more of a bond between their loved one. And then there's peer-based instruction and intervention. And that's where inclusion is it's a very important piece to the lives of our loved one, because peers, regardless, peers have an influence. A child of near peer age is an incredible motivator for a lot of our children, and as an adults. And I actually did a program that I talked about last month, and it was an extended school year program that I used near peer age supports, so that the high school students had college students that they were able to go in the community with, hang out with, travel on buses, the fixed route buses, public transportation, go to restaurants, be able to experience in a peer-based way a way to model, and not through the eyes of an interventionist or a parent. It is somebody, at a peer-based or near peer age. Then there's perceptual motor training and prompting. Again, this kind of goes back to the same relationship development intervention, is using a lot of movement to be able to help with the with movement, helping the individual be able to communicate. Response, interruption, redirection. That, although it's an evidence-based, that is a lot of what a lot of teachers use, a lot of paraeducators, a lot of employment providers in the adult system use the response, interruption, or redirection. Although that's a good thing, what it's not teaching, what it is teaching is prompt dependency. What it's not teaching is why of what I'm doing is interrupting, and why do I need to be redirected. So that's just my soapbox, that my vantage point that I'm relating to. The self-management, especially with social emotional regulation, sensory things, self-management is another really needed tool. One of the things I use, and actually I shared this at a training that I did this morning, and it is using what is called the incredible 5-point scale to help a person identify where they are on the scale of colors, what it looks like when they're experiencing these things, and what they can do for themselves. So rather than saying, calm down, you don't need to get so upset, how do we help a person understand those concepts? And there are, like I said, a book like that, or other options that you can use. That is what's called the incredible 5-point scale. Sensory diets, similar to what I talked about with AIR's sensory integration. It also includes sensory diets, social narratives, or social stories, social skills training, task analysis, technology, aided instruction and intervention, time delay, video modeling, and visual supports. And this is not, this is a this isn't an extensive list. These are the ones that I was able to combine. For the most part, there's about 27 to 35 evidence-based practices based on the different research entities that I provided you at the beginning of the training. So let's move on. ABA. So ABA is really one of the most well-known behavioral intervention used for children with autism. It's kind of like, this is where we start, this is where we go. In truth, ABA is something of an umbrella term. ABA, when people refer to something such as what Dr. Lovaas started at UCLA, it was really, ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. It's a process of applying a or implementing a technique, analyzing the behavior, and what are the outcomes. It's a process. It is actually, it's an intervention that we are able to gather data from, but it is not an intervention. An intervention would be, like I said, something like Lovaas had developed, which would be just great trial training. That's something that was utilized and has had, for some people, a very successful way of reducing significant behaviors, increase a person's vocabulary. It has, and that's why we have insurance companies that are willing to pay for ABA services. The caveat is what type of ABA services are they using? And what I mean, say for that, I'll get into that here in just a minute, but what it means is it is a comprehensive curriculum focusing on imitation, language, toy play, social interaction, motor, and adaptive behavior. Like I said, Washington State Insurance started covering autism treatment using applied behavior analysis, ABA, in 2010. And so it's only been around the last 13 years that families have been able to access this on a consistent basis, that you weren't able to leverage those services before, unless you had some pretty big purse resources, financial resources to be able to pay for that independently. ABA and the process is, it was sensitivity to developmental sequences, how skills are built on one another, like a first then concept, helping a person understand that I do this, I have a reward, the behavioral strategies for reducing interfering behaviors. There was involvement with the parents so that the parents could provide this. And it was a gradual transition to a more naturalistic environment, which wasn't what people were receiving under Lovaas umbrella at UCLA. It was, and I can tell you, seeing some of the videos that Dr. Lovaas, it was, it wasn't bordering on abuse, it was abusive. And so it was managing children using a lot of aggression, having children look at you in the face, making eye contact, which we know now are things that we would not want, demand, hopefully, with a person with a neurodiverse brain. You need highly trained staff. And that was something that the early childhood unit at the University of Washington started with Dr. Eileen Schwartz, that she really was paving the way for ABA in the schools, I would say at the turn of the century, about 2000, 2001. ABA services, before Eileen started working and providing information, we're saying that children needed up to 40 hours of intense delivery of ABA services. The early childhood unit gave really specific data showing that 25 hours per week at least at the first 2 years of a child's life, starting at the age of 2, going until the age of 4, in that developmental window, was very advantageous for children on the spectrum. And I can tell you one of the things when I started the regional autism consulting cadre, that was we had a school district that was fighting one of the schools because they wanted their children to receive ABA services in their home at 40 hours a week. And the school, because there was not a list of evidence-based best practices, because it wasn't in place yet, they were able to effectively turn the family down. What the autism cadre did do, though, is we were able to get highly trained staff based on multiple educational and treatment modalities that we were able to deliver a lot of high quality teachers in school districts that made a difference for a lot of kids. And I would say, including for my own son. So, and what we do know, like I said, applied behavior analysis, ABA, often people refer to it as an approach that really has to do with discrete trial training. And, there are, I'll say ABA, I'll say discrete trial, cognitive behavior, PRT, which is, pivotal response training. But discrete trial training was the primary focus that a lot of people connected when they said ABA. But in fact, over the years, ABA training has enveloped many modalities, not just discrete trial training. And that's one of the things that I tell families is you want to interview your ABA therapist or the ABA clinic. What is their background? What is their mode of implementing applied behavior analysis? If it's just, and this is my specific opinion, that only discrete trial training isn't really going to give a complete amount of services that a child needs, that they're able to generalize it from a clinical setting and take it home and use it in their school building. So interview the ABA therapist, get to know and understand what are some of the ABA strategies that they do use. We know that early intervention programs, whether at home or school-based, implement, like I said, ABA strategies based on discrete trial training. And those often draw on other key approaches, some of which are child-led, which is pivotal response training, which it starts with a K. Again, I'm looking up here. A pivotal response training is a practice very similar to discrete trial training, but it's child-led, meaning if a child is using a car, playing with a car, going back and forth, then the ABA therapist sits and draws themselves into that child's world and builds a relationship based on that child's lead, rather than discrete trial, which is you sit at a table and I have specific tools that I use that I set through a sequence to help a child learn. Pivotal response training, in my opinion, and it's something that I use in my practice, is I would say, especially when it's individual led, it really is building on that person's likes and interests and building a relationship, which is, obviously what we want to do. So a pivotal response would be, I always remember having a child pick up a car on the floor, and the teacher said, "Oh, can I see it?" And the child was looking, and the teacher took it, and then she said, "Oh, you can have it back." So it was a pivotal activity that she based it on that child's, their like and their interest, that child was able to communicate, was able to learn because it was based on their interest. I figure that would be have more a success rate than
Monica?
the clinical process. Yes.
I don't want to, I didn't want to cut you off until you finished that, but there's a question in the
yes.
chat about well, Ruby asks.
Okay, is an ABA for the benefit of neurotypical people? A few places I've spoken to seem to want to stop my 6-year-old nephew from doing things he has to do a variety of types of self-stimming behaviors. Also, why isn't there a requirement for all behavior analysis to be a BCBA? And actually, there is a requirement. You can either be a BCBA or you're under the umbrella of a BCBA therapist, and you are an ABA behavior assistant. So it's sort of like a CODA is for an occupational therapist. A CODA is it's an occupational therapist assistant. It's a certified occupational assistant. So does ABA therapists. They can have somebody who is specialized under the umbrella of a BCBA. Does it mean that they have all the understanding of, of the attributes of, say, a certain, whether it's under a discrete trial, whether it's pivotal response, whether it's cognitive behavior therapy, do they have all that understanding? I can't tell you yes or no, because I can tell you that there are some people that, their understanding of ABA would not be what my understanding of ABA is. And that a child is self-stimming. We know that self-stimulation, and again, it really is understanding that when a child self-stims is oftentimes has to do with their regulation, has to do with their sensory processing and or their anxiety or social emotional regulation. So telling a person to stop stimming oftentimes is because the people around him or her is annoyed by their self-stimming. And so rather than what they're trying to do is stop him from self-stimming, because, and as you put it, it seems that the neurotypical people are the ones that really are having the problem with it, not the person with autism, because they're doing the self-stim for a reason. And it really is incumbent upon us to help people understand that a person who self-stims, we all do self-stimming, for example, but we do it maybe in a less overt way. So, I use my glasses, I move them a lot, I scratch my head. These are all self-stimming things that I do. Yeah, twist your hair, people click their pen, they doodle. Those are all self-stimming. It's just that if ABA is compliance driven, without the understanding of, a behavior related. Now, I can tell you where I would see if you had a child who was engaging in self-injurious behaviors, and I have seen children who, they will pick out their skin until they bleed. They will bang their head against the walls. Those are things that obviously when it comes to the health and safety and well-being of that individual, we want compliance. We don't want that person to hurt themselves. Again, this is my opinion. Self-stimming is a way of for the person to self-regulate. And that would be something that, the parent, the guardian of your nephew would need to speak on that on their behalf. That's where I'm going to get into the controversy of ABA or discrete trial training here in just a moment. ABA controversy. So here we go. So we know that there's controversy over autism's most common therapy, which is basically the umbrella term of ABA. Applied behavior analysis is most widely used therapy for autism, and we know that insurance companies pay for it. Matter of fact, ABA services, depending on the type of ABA services, so if it's pivotal response, and like I said, the work that I do, and I'm working with adults. So one of the things that using pivotal response training and helping a job coach understand how do I get to know a person or build a relationship. So you need to get into their world. And that I used cars is not a mistake. That I had a gentleman who he loved his Matchbox cars, and he would line them up and he would just have them in size order and in color fade. So it starts with, something red and would go to yellow. So it would be anywhere between, red, orange, and yellow that he would set things up. And so the job coaches was like, I don't know how to interact with this individual. People that he'd worked with before is just kind of hanging out in maybe in the front room watching a TV show, and then they would chat. Well, that didn't work for this gentleman. So what I did, knowing what one of his favorite activities had to do with cars, I went to Goodwill and I bought cars. I bought a bunch of Matchbox or Hot Wheels, and I brought my cars with me. And I tell you, as soon as I put them out, I had his immediate attention, not me, but I had joint attention based on his likes and interests. He was really interested in what I was doing. And so I would line my cars up, and then I would point at his. He would line his cars up. Then the next time I saw him, and I would do a very quick thing. I'm finished. I'm going to leave. The next time I came, which would be like a couple of days later, I brought it was a box that I drew like racing stripes down. So I put my car at one end and I flicked it with my thumb, with my finger, and it went down the lane. And he looked at me, he put his car down, and he did the same thing. We're working on something that is a liked interest. We built on that relationship based on Matchbox cars or Hot Wheels. I didn't go in and demand that he was compliant. I didn't demand that he needed to pay attention to me. I wanted, and he deserves the respect that I could give him, and that we can build on a relationship based on his needs. So those would be some of the things that I would, again, this is why ABA therapy is that there is some controversy to it, because discrete trial training has been basically built on drills and routines that a lot of people felt were cruel, and the aims were misguided to help the person be socially appropriate, when oftentimes it has to do with how do we help this square peg fit into the round world of life. And it's not that we want to cut down those edges, because that's what makes that person neurodiverse, makes them unique. What we can do is help them learn how to gain relationships. Again, if a person is engaging in really self-injurious behaviors and harming others, there is a place for applied behavior analysis, but I wouldn't, that would be something that a person would need to do the research on. What is it that you feel is going to be the best for the individual? Because we know in recent years, is the third line here says parents have had cause to question ABA therapy, largely because of fiercely articulate and vocal community of adults with autism. That these advocates, many of them were childhood recipients of ABA, say that the therapy was harmful to them. They contend that ABA is based on a cruel premise of trying to make people with autism normal. It's a goal articulated in the 1960s by Dr. Lovas, who said, the development of ABA, discrete child training for autism, was that children needed to assimilate to the social culture. And we know in this day and age of diversity, equity, and inclusion that people need to come as and who they are. It's just, it is a process, and it's a process that is evolving. But we know that what they advocated for is acceptance of their neurodiversity, the idea that people with autism or say they have attention deficit disorder or Tourette's should be respected as naturally different rather than abnormal and needing to be fixed. We can certainly help people with tools. We know that people have been excluded for a lot of things because they were not socially appropriate. And I'm actually doing a project, and I know Malia's heard me talk about universal design for learning. It's universal design for learning is the having access to a teacher, to a classroom, to a business, that the business has taken onus of how they can be more accepting of a neurodiverse or diverse population of people who are seeking services. The acceptance, we held really firm and true that people need to be socially acceptable. And that is not always the case. I can tell you, for years, we went to a church service that was adapted for people with disabilities. And it was a place that, at least, although it was exclusive, it was inclusive because it was inclusive that anybody with any disability could participate in. But people could screech, could run, could be mobile. It wasn't that they had to sit and attend to the service. And what we did is we actually helped them and helped them participate by doing um, like a play of a liturgical sermon, so that they were part of it rather than just sitting and being socially appropriate. Because we know that a person with a neurodiverse brain oftentimes doesn't have control of that. Many times, not only do they not have control of it, oftentimes they're doing it to self-regulate so that they won't become aggressive, that they won't have an outburst that could be self-injurious. So we have a long ways to go, I would say, when trying to help our communities understand what it is to have access to our community. Normal is only a setting on a dryer. There is nobody that is normal. There is, a perceived medium of people, but all that does is oftentimes marginalize a lot of people because they're not able to fit into that round circle, because the marginalized individuals are the square pegs. And we need, okay, this is Monica's soapbox, we need to have a community that is inviting and is accepting and knows how to meet the needs of people who are coming into their businesses, who are patronizing their restaurants, etc. ABA has, this is according to Ari Newman, who says ABA has a destructive approach to parents, and that he is the president of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, which is one of the resources I have quoted at the beginning of this training. And he is a prominent leader in the neurodiverse movement. The message is that if you don't work with, basically the message is, with either at school, whether it's a doctor, if you don't work with an ABA provider, your child has no hope. That's not true. There was a really strong message years ago that if you miss that window of opportunity, you are missing a lot for your child, and they will not be truly fulfilled. Again, those thoughts have been disbanded, that are not true, though we do want, as any child, have opportunity to early intervention services, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, or have a person with an intellectual disability. We know that early intervention services is just a step up. It helps the person be more productive in their educational career. Oops, I went backwards. So what we do know is whether ABA is helpful or harmful, that has been a highly contentious topic, such as a flashpoint that few people who aren't already advocates are willing to speak out about it publicly because it is such a contentious topic. Many people who are asked to comment on ABA really oftentimes decline because the negative feedback, whatever side that they're on, it has really become a divided thought of how to educate children or anybody on the autism spectrum at any age. There was one woman who blogs with her daughter, who her daughter has autism, and she had to shut down comments on the posts that was critical of her experience with an ABA intensive ABA program because the volume of comments. Many of the ABA therapists defending their therapies, the type of therapy was so high and so detrimental to her business, she had to shut down her blog. And again, not all ABA therapists, not all BCBA therapists are alike. It's like going to a pediatrician. You're going to go to a pediatrician who may be very conventional in their practice, and you may go to a pediatrician who is more engaged in maybe alternative ways to support your child. So it is the same way with, an ABA therapist, a BCBA, I should say. So, and it's same thing with a teacher. Personalities have a big influence on how that is provided. So Shannon Rosa, she's a co-founder and an influential advocate group, Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, says that she posts about ABA on her group's Facebook page, but she needs to set aside a complete day to be able to moderate comments because it is antagonistic, it is threatening, it is all over the place. And so when I say ABA is controversial, that's an understatement. And the thing that we need to really consider is the perspective on who is receiving ABA services. What type of services? We know that self-advocates who don't experience an intellectual disability, who are verbal, are able to say, this was something that was that had a negative influence on my life. Well, we have families of children who are autistic, nonverbal, and have an intellectual disability. The benefits and how can we the expectation that a person who does not have an intellectual disability, who is verbal, do we have the expectation that they can speak for everyone on the spectrum? We don't know. But that is something that we have to, again, it is something that needs to be, it will, obviously, because of the contentiousness around ABA therapy, there will be continual research, and maybe there will be an answer to this someday. But we do know ABA that was just a line in the sand, discrete trial training, was not accepted for a long time, that they had to incorporate, and many ABA therapists and BCBA clinics do incorporate multiple best practices. They'll use visual supports. They'll use picture exchange. They'll use pivotal response training. There's some that really just want to focus on discrete trial training. But again, that's going to be through the interview with the family, the guardian, on what exactly does this agency provide. And like I said, it can be all over the map. Because one person has an opinion about one thing doesn't mean that they're having the same experience. So before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, let's step back and let's let some research, let's let families make that determination. Let's let individuals understand what is the focus and the function. And it's not that every school needs to have, in my opinion, a BCBA on staff, although in some places it would be warranted. So it's, like I said, it is pretty much all over the place. But we do know that best practice evidence-based services and supports for a person with autism provides a direction. Like I said, the mom who talked about her son, 30 years ago, there wasn't a direction. When my son was entering school, there were no directions. There wasn't a list of evidence-based practices. There wasn't even data that shows the prevalence of autism. There was nothing. There was still the mindset that mothers caused their children's autism, that it was because of the mother's unfeeling and cold relationship with the child that caused the autism. Dr. Bruno Bettelheim was that psychologist who said and promoted this all the way through the 70s. He was even on, if anybody's anywhere, and I don't even remember, I remember the name Dick Cavett. He had a talk show, and he actually had Dr. Bruno Bettelheim on this show and talked about what it is about families and mothers and how they are, they actually were taking children away from their parents because they thought they were causing the autism. This is how far we have come in 40 years. And when you think about science, 40 years is not a very long time. When you think about, there has been generations, when I look at my family, generation-wise, that I had a cousin who was in an institution starting at the age of 4, that my children, the next generation, he went to school. And that other children now are able to receive best practice services and interventions. They weren't there. And it's been in a very short time frame that we need to look at that best practices. It's an evolving practice, and someday I hope that we have people that are accepting of neurodiversity, and that we have a better answer when it comes to best practice evidence-based services and supports. We want that the best case scenario is putting the onus on the instructor to provide best practice evidence-based instruction and support, whether that is the job coach, the early childhood provider, whomever it is in an instructional role will have a good understanding of what best practice evidence-based services and supports are. I can tell you, as an ITA specialist in the state of Washington, the majority of people that I work with, including families, don't understand what evidence-based practices are and why things are implemented the way they are and the reason for them. What's best going to happen is, especially when children are in school, is family and advocates are going to be able to measure the progress, whether it is using a best practice evidence-based support. And my son has used Division Teach out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, visual supports for probably 25 years with a huge success, using social stories with huge success. So there are things that being able to use evidence-based practices has made a huge difference in his life, from the point of being in school as a child, being tied to his chair, to a person's ability to be able to do his grocery shopping, to understand what are the expectations that he has of a certain task that he's going to be doing in the community. Not that I want him to be socially appropriate. I want him to be successful in his ventures anywhere in the community. But we do need and want to know and make sure that the teachers, while they're in school, have training and certificates. And I know that, we had mentioned, why don't they have certificates? Because oftentimes there isn't enough BCBAs, but like with anything, a BCA can oversee, but it doesn't mean that BCBA assistant has the extensive education that the BCBA does. That could be something that a parent could ask for, to say, I want to make sure that, that is the right of a parent, is a free and appropriate public education, not a free and adequate, it's appropriate. And the appropriate stands for, I need to have a teacher that has training and certificates in these best practices, evidence-based supports and strategies. So how about adult services? Well, we do know that there are evidence-based practices that, the Autism, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, as well as all the other ones that I had listed, show there is evidence of efficacy across the whole lifespan. What I can tell you in adult services, evidence-based practices do not exist for adults. They're the only entitlement our children, our loved ones will get is while they're in school. That's an entitlement. And there is a pushback that teachers have to have this level of service and education. When a child exits the school, it is long entitlement. They can access it only based on that they were able to qualify for, let's say, DDA services or DVR services, and if money is available. It is not an entitlement, and therefore there isn't the entitlement that the community will have those services in place. Oftentimes, our adult service providers have been taught on compliance-based supports, typically implemented through prompt dependency, telling a person to do things over and over, redirecting a person rather than giving them the educational understanding and the foundation of why am I doing this? Why is it important for me? DSHS, DDA, DVR, they do not implement evidence-based best practices. It's really, that's the part, the advocacy is going to be on the part of the individual, the family, or the guardian. And that I can tell you as one of my roles that I provide to different counties and to state. Like this morning, I did a 4-hour training on socialization, living with individuals, living with other housemates, and being able to go out in the community. And it was not based on compliance. My training was based on how is it, for instance, you don't put 3 or 4 people with autism living in a house together. Just because, you have a group of people with red hair does not mean they all think and do the same thing. And unfortunately, what has happened is that has been the norm. Well, we're going to put all the people with high behavioral needs in this house, when it oftentimes is their sensory system is just completely has been blown. Their ability to even think, that they are constantly in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. And what they are wanting from this person is compliance. Don't hit, don't do this, don't do that, without the person, without strength-based supports. And so, like I said, my training this morning was based on strength-based, understanding how the person experiences their autism. How is it that we can help support them based on their strengths, their interests, their sensory needs, their cognitive abilities, and make sure that we have those supports in place. And that's our role. That's what we have to make sure that are in place. And I can tell you, my job of doing training and technical assistance in this field, and I've been doing this now for almost 25 years, has not evolved. It is the same today as it was 25 years ago. Training that is provided to our direct support providers. There isn't any difference. What I can tell you is I've made it my mission, my passion is to make sure that people do get the rightful supports and strategies that they need in their life. I do it because my son, he needs it. I actually train all of his supported living providers. I have actually his job coach is somebody that worked for me, and she supports Michael out in the community because it just can't be somebody. He is 6'1", he weighs 185 pounds and can be very aggressive. And if those support strategies aren't in place, he will aggress on somebody. And what happens then? The police become involved. That person goes through a system, the criminal system, that is it the fault of the individual? Of course, hitting somebody or aggressing towards somebody is, quote, not socially appropriate, but it is a cause and effect of not having the right support strategies in place, understanding that person's needs. And like, again, this morning, I gave the example of Michael has a visual schedule that says where we're going to go, what we're going to do, how long we're going to be there, and when we're going to leave. And then what he can expect when he gets home. I also provide him with a social story that helps him understand that when people cough or sneeze, they're not doing it purposely to hurt his ears. It's because they have, they have a cold or they're sick. So he has a good understanding of what's going on. That's just out of respect. That's not out of compliance. I want to make sure he has those things in place, because if we're just going by compliance based, what happens when he has one provider in the morning, a different one in the afternoon, and yet a different one at night? Each person is going to engage Michael differently. That Michael has to adapt to every single person that comes into his life. And guess what? He has the disability. All the support providers should be adapting to his needs. We need to make sure we turn that narrative around, instead of saying, well, we need him to, he needs to understand he can't hit somebody. He needs to understand that he can't eat Timmy's food off his plate. He needs to understand these things. And it's like, of course, and this is how we can do it. We can help Timmy understand that his bedroom, his door is color coded. The food in his refrigerator is color coded. His placemat on the table shows where his food is, and Tim has a completely different placemat. So we can differentiate that this is your food that belongs to him, so that we are using best practice evidence-based supports to help a person understand what are the expectations, rather than saying, don't do that. We need the expectation that we want to help the person understand what they can do rather than what not to do. And that's what I often hear is, we have somebody that just runs out the door, and I tell them, don't go out the door. Guess where they go? They go out the door, because in their processing, all they hear is out the door. Rather, it could be, stay here, please, stay in the house. It gives that person the intention and the information that they need, rather than discipline of what not to do. It's ineffective. It's not going to work. So as I said, evidence-based supports are only effective for those who know and understand it. The process of us interviewing people to make sure that the therapists have the understanding and knowledge of what you're looking for, either as a parent or guardian, or just a loved one that's concerned over their nephew. And know when they exit school, the services aren't going to be in place that are necessary for this person to be socially accepted. That what we have to do, that's going to be our advocacy on our part, is to provide that person's access. And I can tell you, there have been on more than one occasion that we've been asked to leave because he's too loud. We've have had, just the looks of, like disdain because he's making noises, or he's standing up, and it's just like, what is he doing? Rather than other places that we have gone that are incredibly accepting of Michael, perhaps the noise that he's making, that he needs to stand up and walk, that he's going to have myself or a staff person go with him, that he is accepted at whatever level that he goes into an environment. Those are the places that I'm going to frequent. And I can tell you, I've been in doing this a long time, and I've gotten to the point where I'm just sick and tired of trying to teach people. I'm gotten to the point where we have to, Michael isn't going to be the ambassador for his disability anymore. Well, I can't say that. He will continue to be his own ambassador. I am going to be going to businesses and saying, this is what he needs so that he can be able to frequent your business. These are the things that he needs to have in place. And I'm going to call ahead. I'm going to make sure these things are in place. I'm going to try and change people's attitudes and opinions rather than trying to change or mask Michael's neurodiversity and have him be compliant, what is socially appropriate, so his community can be adaptive to him. So I know I talked a lot. I really want to know your thoughts. You know, the movement and pervasiveness of autism continues to grow. The one thing we need to do is be open, be accepting of neurodiversity, understand that autism is a spectrum with co-occurring disabilities, such as an intellectual disability, a mental health diagnosis, and or more. Or it could be a person is just, not just, they have a neurodiversity of autism, but even at that, we can explain where it is that they fall on that continuum, that each person is going to be unique. So it's, you know, just Michael's even ability to access a health provider. It's their understanding of it is remote. And so it's just that constant teaching that that needs to happen. But like I said, I'm getting to that age where I'm like, it's like, doggone it. People wake up. We need to have, you know, the ability for people to be included isn't because the person's not being socially appropriate. It's because our community is not accepting of neurodiversity, in my humble opinion.
So I have to admit, I was not expecting the answer you gave on the last slide about adults. That was
Oh.
like, oh, okay. So there
Mhm.
isn't anything out there. I can't just send my son or daughter to this or that place,
No,
occupational therapy or whatever, and have it
hope for the
fixed.
best.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, no. I would love to say that that is, you know, that's not the case, but that's the excess that for the many, literally hundreds of people that I have worked on behalf of or have supported, adult services fall extremely short the needs of a person with autism specifically, and especially those with autism and a co-occurring disability. And that being said, I've worked with people that have autism and no intellectual disability, and they are falling through the cracks desperately. That just for instance, I have a friend of mine who has a son who is in his late 20s, and he has a very interesting tone to his voice that his last employer felt it was very irritating, and he found every way he could, and he just basically said, I can't handle his voice. You can't change his voice. I mean, it's like, for heaven's sakes, it was like, you know, how many of us have heard people's voices like, wow, that's an interesting voice. And he does have an interesting voice, and he has a different way of communicating. Even my son, it's funny because someone said he sounds sort of like what's his name? Yoda.
Oh,
On Star Wars. Is it Yoda? Yeah,
yeah.
because he will say something backwards, like, what's her name, red shirt? You know, instead of saying that lady with the red shirt, what's her name? It's like, what's her name, red shirt? I mean, and unless you understand what he's trying to say, somebody might get like, huh, I don't get that. So yeah, I would love to say that, oh, life is it's better and for adults with autism and an intellectual disability, and even without an intellectual disability, that we know that research and data has showed that the majority of people with autism, whether they have an intellectual disability or not, a high percentage of them are not employed, that they are, gosh, I don't know who's calling me at this time of night. They're not employed. Oftentimes they are on some sort of public assistance like Social Security, because they can't find a job. They're not able to hold a job. They're not able to, work in collaboration with a team of people, because they don't know the subtleties, the social nuances of, um, say a work team. And that is where a lot of corporations have moved towards, is how can we work together? We work better as a team than individually. There are places like Microsoft and Boeing and different places that have, actually Nike, Adidas have all done the same thing, that they have stepped up, and are seeking people with autism to do different jobs because of um, their high interest in precision. Um, and some people, and especially in the autism community, are pushing back saying, that's exploiting a person.
Mm.
And other people are saying, no, you're tapping into their strengths and interests. So there's going to be this this constant, um, you know, pushback on, I would say for a long time, um, as we evolve through all this, that's how things change. That's how it's not through, um, positive collaboration. It is usually through, um, people not liking the status quo. They want to change, and that,
Yeah.
when you have adversity, that's when changes happen. And so that's what we're going through. And I can tell you, as my son is nearing his 40th birthday, that, he's come a long ways. His support, his ability to communicate, his ability to actually read, you know, the things that, his teachers when he was younger said, oh, he'll never be able to read, he'll never be able to write, he'll never, I mean, he is a person that is on the computer, he reads, he writes, he's able to do, I think it is Microsoft Paint. He's able to go into a place. This is, for instance, what he wanted. He wanted to tell me, but he couldn't say it in words. He wanted to go to the zoo. So what he did is that he found a picture of Highway 26 in Oregon that showed the Oregon Zoo picture. Then he copy and pasted his picture onto the exit sign. I said, you want to go to the zoo? Yes. But he couldn't say it otherwise. But he took all that trouble of going in, finding the zoo, finding his picture, and then he put like Tracy's picture on it and my picture on it, his direct support provider. So this is who he wants to go to the zoo with. That's how his brain works, is in a very visual way. That doesn't mean that everybody's does work in that way, but having people understand that you can't just tell Michael something, because he's not going to do it. He's not going to understand unless it's in a visual format. Then he's able to understand it. And it can be handwriting, it can be drawing, it could be in multiple things, but it's finding out what the strength and interest is of a person that we need to build on. Is there any other questions? Any other comments? Oh, Ruby did say, I did not know adults with autism are not engaged with evidence-based practices for worker training. We'll be researching to see if there are any work I can support to help change this. That would be awesome. I know of a couple of agencies that I have worked with personally in my community, which I live in the south part of the state in Clark County. Is one of my employees actually works at a supported employment agency, and she has become their go-to person, that she provides, training for that agency. But she is, that is the exception. I work in multiple counties in the state, from the east side, west side, north and south. And I'm always surprised when I walk in. I shouldn't be surprised, because the turnover rate of employees is so high. The ability to get people at the level of education they need to support people with high acuity supports is, it's just not feasible. How are they able to do that when you might have, say, for instance, I've worked at one agency for almost a year and helping them do the training. And of the individuals that have come on, they worked, the new job coaches worked with 4 individuals with the highest needs. They had autism, they had exceptional behavioral issues, they were nonverbal, and they gave them to the least trained people. And it was like, holy cow. So I get them trained up to the point that the agency starts using them for other people. And then we restart that whole process again. And so it's always, it's instead of having the job coach come in and meet the person at where they're at, the job coach starts down here and they have to bring the person with autism down with them. And then they start to grow and then it goes down again. I would love to say that, you know, that's a rarity. That's unfortunately that's what happens. And it's going to be on us as a person exits school to make sure that we have all the information that we know that has been best practice, that has shown that this person has been able to acquire skills, that we insist that people are using those in adult services. Doesn't because once a person is actually in services, they should receive services based on their disability because that is a civil right. And so there's I know my team has less OT, PT, and ABA therapy. ABA has been successful for him, especially at Kennedy Kiger Institute, inpatient for feeding therapy at the age of 8. Absolutely. And it says it was a battle to get insurance to cover it, though since out of state and different TRICARE region. I like the part where you say not to calm down and to tell the person stay here versus what not to do. And then we have Malia that also noted that most job coaches start at the pay range, and even $17 an hour is in some places high. I don't know what the minimum rate or the minimum wage is. It 17 now? I thought it was 15.
That's what I got paid.
Oh, okay.
So maybe I was
think,
overpaid. I don't know.
oh my God. Yeah. So the minimum wage for the state of Washington, I believe is,
Like
I'm going to look it up
15
because I'm not going to, it's
15
what?
something. 15 something.
15 something. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
It progressively has gone up.
But
Yeah, 1574. It went up from 1419 and now it started in January 1st that it went up to 1574. So just think people start at some agencies at $17 an hour. But if you go down the street to Taco Bell, I mean, heaven's sakes, you could be a lead
20.
starting at $20 an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, so it does kind of say where our values are perhaps in our community. I would love to be the one that says, yes, these are the things you can do, but I can say, yes, these are things that you can ask for. And yes, once your son or daughter, your loved one receives services and adult services, yes, you can say, I want somebody to have a good understanding of autism. I would like to have, like, say, for instance, myself, I could come in and provide training and technical assistance to a job coach, to the DVR counselor, to whomever, and take the information from a person's IEP or do an assessment based on, the characteristics of autism and where that person falls on the continuum and where their strengths and interests are and how we can build on that using evidence-based practices. So it isn't all bad news. What it is, it's understanding and advocating and being persistent, and don't accept anything less. I mean, these are, our kids, our loved ones that we are, really fighting for. And as I said, when Michael first started school, there was nothing in school. And although schools aren't perfect, we have evolved immensely from what it was 30, 35 years ago. Huge. So progress, right now it's not perfection, but we are making progress, and you're going to be part of that journey. You're going to be part of the next generation of people that are going to say, you know, we need to do things different. We're not going to accept the status quo. We need to be looking at people's disabilities, what their likes and interests are, and what has the person used in school that was successful that we can replicate, because those are evidence-based, and we should be able to ask for that.
I have a question about, can kids age out of ABA? That's what it felt like in my experience,
It
or
depends, again, on the agency. There are a lot of agencies that just only want to work with children under the age of 12. And then we have other agencies that say we'll work with the student if they're still in school. There is the rarity that there are ABA therapists that will work with adults, but they're there. Matter of fact, I have a person that I'm working with that we were talking about just before we started this training, that they are receiving ABA therapy, believe it or not, in a hospital setting.
oh,
Yeah, we've we fought for that, and he is getting it. So
okay, all right.
so like I said, we started this journey for this young man in October of last year.
Yeah.
It has taken a long time and a lot of persistence and a lot of, oh my gosh, this family has been pushed to the point of, I think, having a nervous breakdown, because I actually got to the point when an employee of a hospital was basically was shaming this mom, saying, I can't believe you would leave him at the hospital. I can't believe that you're doing this. And I had to stop and I said, we're not going to move anything forward using shaming and blaming. He was being very aggressive and assaulting his very small mother. That you are frustrated because you don't have an opening in your hospital for other people who might have critical needs. That's another issue, that we can't find a place in the community to help this individual. That's the problem. But shaming and blaming a parent is not, you have not walked a mile in their shoes. You do not understand that. So we need to leave that off the table. And if she has literally, I would say in the last month, has not brought it up even for a second. And I'm like,
Good.
because I had to call her out, and I don't like being that person. I don't like being that person, but I will, because it needs to happen. So it's 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
I appreciate you all taking the time this evening. I hope you were able to learn something about evidence-based and best practices, and
Oh, and we're going to,
you'll
you'll send me the link to this slide, because you have it on Google Drive, and then we'll have that whole list of different kinds of therapies that we could refer back to. That would be useful. And I'll send that email with the video tomorrow or the next day.
Awesome. All righty. Well, thank you all. Michael, Ruby, Susie, and KT. I don't have your first name, or if you go by KT. And thank you, Malia. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Night.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.